Hi everyone, welcome. I've got a couple worm bins that I plan on feeding today. One of them is here on the bench already. These systems have European nightcrawler composting worms living in them. And the two systems that I've got buddied up today, there's probably about, a good 5 or 6 weeks difference in ages between them. But since they're both European nightcrawlers and they're kind of close in age, I figured I'd team them up and feed them on the same day. Which means they get fed on the same day, they get fed the same stuff. However, during the last check-in, the younger of these two bins, this is the older one, the other bin that we're going to check in on momentarily, had sort of a novelty item placed into it, which we're going to check in on once we get to that system. But we're going to start here first to feed these guys, and then we'll make our way over to that other system. That other system received a supposedly compostable bag, and when I see compostable, sometimes I wonder what that really actually means, because sometimes my guess is that when they say something's compostable, it might rely on the type of composting that generates a tremendous amount of heat for a period of time, and maybe that's really the type of composting that they had in mind when they classified that bag as compostable. So I don't know if keeping it in a sort of cool composting system such as a worm bin will ever take it to that point where it even begins breaking down. So I guess we'll see over time. I think that only after 11 days we're not going to see much progress on that thing when we get over there, so I'm not holding my breath by any means. So the stuff that was fed to these systems 11 days ago when that bag was placed in there consisted of, there was a banana peel, there was some strawberry, and some mushroom. And when we applied bedding, we applied a whole bunch of this stuff that was also sprinkled out on the top surface. A whole bunch of leaves that I've got collected up. I'm seeing a whole bunch of stuff that came in with the leaves, these little branches. Because when I collect the leaves using the machine that sucks them up into the bag, it also brings with it some stuff that I don't generally put into my worm bin, such as branches or sticks. So I've been getting in the habit of just pulling those out when I bump into them. And there's going to be another amount of leaves, probably comparable to this that I just collected off the top surface down in the feeding area. It was laid down as the foundation for the feeding. So I'm curious to see how that stuff's coming along. Sometimes since it's put into the systems dry, it doesn't even absorb any of the system's moisture into it. So it just sits down there, remains dry. So I'll be curious to see if it managed to get dampened a little bit by being down there. Perhaps a little bit of it that was exposed to the neighboring materials, but chances are if it was kind of in a little bit of a pile, which is probably the way I left it, then there could be bits of it that are just not really dampened yet. So I mean, of the stuff they got last time, the mushrooms and the strawberries, I doubt we're going to see many leftovers. The banana peel, though, I anticipate seeing leftovers of, almost certainly. And this is just an object that was placed into the system quite some time ago, the stem of a pumpkin. It's always interesting to see how the worms gradually find little nooks and crannies to nestle into, perhaps even start burrowing down into it as the material softens up and they could chew themselves a little burrow down into it. So I think the only other sort of leftover we're probably going to expect to find in here is that stem of the, the stem and probably still the peel of the banana. That's just another piece of pumpkin stem too. So this, I think, just based on the look of it, seems like the stem of a banana, but it looks like something that's probably worked down over a greater amount of time than just 11 days. And here's another stem of a banana. The banana peel itself might go within a couple weeks, but the stem will probably take a couple months in general. Here's another slow composting item, the corn cob. Excuse me. Okay. It's kind of unusual that we're not really seeing the banana peel. It would be kind of interesting if they actually did rip through it although we might actually bump into it before we finish here. Here's another stem of a banana. So we've already seen 3 or 4 banana stems over here. And I know that only one banana peel was placed in here last time, so one of those stems could actually be the only remains of the banana peel that was placed in here last time. Actually, this, I believe, appears to be a little bit of it, and it's really heavily worked considering only 11 days have passed since it was put in here, which is kind of nice to see. In some of my other systems, you bump into a banana peel after that much time and it's still kind of holding together. Perhaps even the individual peel segments are still even connected together at that little flower end, or wherever it might still be connected to, depending on how you open up the banana. Alright, well, I guess I'm kind of pleased to see some of the things we're noticing here, which is like no leftovers of strawberry or mushroom, which is kind of cool, although we might have just breezed right past some of the leaves of the strawberry, which are probably still leftovers in here. We just haven't seen any of them because of the variety of different colors and everything. And I'm also quite pleased to see that the banana peel made such wonderful progress over just 11 days. And it was also kind of nice to see how the leaves placed down underneath the feeding zone all seem to experience a little bit of worm traffic and have some castings deposited down in between them. So it didn't just sit there as a big pile of stuff making no progress. It did seem like the worms did a pretty decent job working a lot of this stuff down in just 11 days. So I would have to say that the progress that I noticed based on this most recent interval between feedings is perhaps a little bit better than I anticipated. So we've actually excavated a pretty good sized hole here. Very little material still remains down there at the bottom. Oops, that's it for my glove, I guess. We'll see if we can make it last through the remainder of this check-in. But I'd like to return this material that we scraped all off the top surface down a little bit deeper this time. Use this as the foundation for today's feeding, and if the progress they made on those leaves that were placed fresh down into the feeding area last time is any indication of what to expect, then these already nicely inoculated leaves that have been in the bin for the past 11 days will probably really be hitting the ground running and get a great deal of action almost instantly. So something tells me by the next time we come in here we're going to see very few, if any, remaining leftovers of leaves. Obviously, I'm not referring to the stems of the leaves, because the stems of the leaves, those always stick around for quite a while. They're like little sticks basically, but the leafy material on the leaves will probably get gobbled up prior to our next check-in on these systems. So now the stuff they're getting today for food, it's got a little bit of like a greasy, oily content to it, because it's the greens that were used to flavor some soup broth but were pulled out, like these bits of parsley. And the stuff that you see down here, these large chunks, are the like when you see it on the shelf at the farmer's market, it's called celery knob. So the celery is the part that grows above the ground, and the celery knob is sort of its root. And it's got a good, good strong flavor. It gives the soup a delicious taste. And some people will even eat it, but if you're loading up your soup with a bunch of carrots and other things, then this is just overkill and can be fished out. So if you're not eating this stuff, it just ends up going to waste for the most part. But around here, nothing that is compostable goes to waste. It gets fed to the worms. But you know what? In between the old leftover bits and the newly added foods we're going to give them today, I'd like to include a little bit more bedding, and I'm going to use my prepared bedding for this today. And my prepared bedding is a combination of shredded paper, shredded cardboard, and I even include some little bits of leafy material in there too. And the whole concoction is dampened a little bit. And it was prepared only a few days ago, so it's not like the bedding on the very bottom. It's not like that nice seasoned leafy material that was sprinkled down below the recycled foods. This stuff is kind of on the sterile side, somewhat boring side. So hopefully the worms are able to adopt it as a place to hang out in time. But before we put in these large chunks of food, I'm also going to introduce some of my worm chow down into the bedding material, so that even though it's, somewhat sterile material, maybe by introducing some stuff that the worms might be interested in nibbling on into it, we can heighten the interest a little. And we'll sprinkle in a little bit of grit too after we've plopped in the foods. So these things might not appear to be a whole lot, but they've got a good bit of weight to them. There's a good bit of moisture content to these. And a lot of the moisture is actually, I guess just fat, from the other things that were used to make the soup stock. There was some chicken bones, there was some beef bones, and all the fattiness that came off the meat and the bones. A large amount of it that just ended up in the soup also kind of stuck to these veggies, making them a little bit greasy and oily, and that's why what you're seeing on my gloves, you're not really seeing moisture there in the form of water. That's probably mostly grease. Which is why I'm trying to avoid not touching stuff, because it'll just make it all slippery and slimy. And I'm attempting not to, get stuff like that. Especially like the side of the bin where I would maybe go to grab it later and then it would slip out of my hand because it was all slimy and greasy. I don't want to have that happen. So this is kind of what I was thinking of in terms of how to feed these little guys today. And you know what? Why don't we just go ahead and we treat them to a little bit more of this somewhat boring, if not entirely sterile, bedding material over here on the top. And I assume by the next time we come in to check on these systems, it won't be a boring, sterile bedding material anymore. By that time, it'll hopefully have gotten infiltrated by the microbiology that lives inside our worm bins and make it into something that's interesting for the worms to live in and use as bedding, and hopefully eventually consume as food too. So I'm going to use some of the material that we excavate from the far edges of the bin as cover for the feeding area. Although I think the feeding area is now pretty well covered, so we can just continue to level things off at this point. I'm also just going to take a quick peek at how things out on this edge look too. It's always so interesting to see how many worms are really inhabiting the bin, because a lot of them you do find down in the feeding area, but I've also noticed how many of them I tend to find in the outskirts, in the far outer edges of the bin, furthest away from where the feedings have been getting applied. So it is kind of, to me at least, seems to be a good indicator that says that the entire contents of the container are made up of materials that the worms are quite happy to occupy and hang out in. It means the moisture level's good. It means that there's sufficient bedding and food supplies everywhere. So to me, this appears to be a pretty nice and healthy system that the worms are enjoying and comfortable living in. So back on goes our coffee filter, which just indicates to us where we last fed, down the middle over here. And back on with the plastic covering. I had folded it over in half just to try to prevent any of these worms that are hanging out on it from freaking out because of the dry air hitting it. I figured by folding it over, the moisture content of the material that's stuck to it and the worms remains nice and comfortable. Perhaps only the bright lights would have freaked them out a little bit, so I usually do take a quick peek around where the plastic was just to make sure no worms scurried off of it, responding to the light, and ended up someplace inhospitable. Alright, very cool. I like the way things look here. Let's go get the younger bin. And even though there's a number of weeks difference in the ages between these two systems, I do eventually just start to consider them as being more or less identical because of the, you know, the very consistent manner in which I attempt to maintain them. What you're seeing here is the the carcass of a housefly. Somehow I've managed to get a number of houseflies that have snuck into my wormery here. So almost every time I come down here, I see one or two of them hanging out on the window. And my visit to the wormery always seems to begin with sort of a little bit of a fly hunt, a little fly swatting expedition to try to knock them out. It would be nice to sort of, address that problem at its source. I think what we're seeing here, these little white specks on the coffee, I think those are mites, and I think there's some of them right there as well. Now, in addition to the mites on this coffee filter, there's also a good number of springtails walking around. But in addition to the insects, did anyone happen to notice the other kind of novel thing that was going on in the frame? I know I did. It was happening right over here. I don't want to spoil it in case you're still guessing, but yeah, that was a couple worms attached to each other mating, which was kind of nice to see. However, worms did what they'll do normally. Once there's bright lights shining on them, they both kind of scurried down into the bedding, and hopefully we didn't really interfere with the process too much. Hopefully they're still continuing and finishing what they started there. Although, by the time we get done here, the better part of the system will have been, for the most part, upturned. And any worms that are busy doing what they were doing there are probably going to get distracted and flee. And what they were doing were they were trying to create one of these, a cocoon. A worm cocoon is the result of worms breeding, and then the worm cocoon, in the matter of maybe 3 or 4 weeks, eventually hatches, and out comes the baby worms. So let's proceed down into the feeding area. If you'll remember what I mentioned earlier, the one thing novel or different about this system is going to be that compostable bag that was placed into here. And the way I put it in here was such that I tied off the open end of the bag, so that if at some point, maybe we'll wait a few weeks or months even, and if we observe no deterioration, we'll have to assume that the composting process that they had in mind when they labeled the bag as compostable was kind of a hot composting environment. But I don't know. I saw compostable. I thought, well, let's see if that means worm compostable. So I'm thinking of kind of trying to loosen up the contents of this whole feeding area a little bit so that I can gingerly remove the bag without causing it to tear by me handling it, so that if there is any degradation on it, such as any holes or nibbling, it won't be because I tore a hole into it. It'll be because the worms created the hole. And I gotta tell you, I'm not sure if it's coming through on the camera, but I am seeing cocoons right here by my thumb. I kind of tried to move it out here. I saw another one too, so the cocoons do seem to be piling up in this system quite nicely. So now here's the knot that I tied into the end of it in the hopes that I can prevent any worms from slithering into it. And I'll tell you the truth, after 11 days I'm not expecting to see a whole lot of progress on this thing, if any. But it does seem to make sense that we should at least check to see what we see. And I got to admit, I don't remember if the bag had any holes in it or not already from the beginning. It might have, but it may not have. I'm just very carefully trying to check it out, and kind of at the same time spread it out a little bit so that when we do return it back down into the feeding area, I can do so without it going in as just a big mound or a wad. I would like to sort of spread it out a little bit so that it's got a large surface area, and perhaps because of that, a good bit of worm traffic on it. So let's continue with the excavation. Now we can be a little bit more, rough. It was just the bag that I wanted to be careful with to make sure I don't tear it. And once again, we're seeing the leafy matter that was placed down into this system for the worms as bedding last time. It's really coming along nicely. I mean, here and there I'm hitting pockets of it where it feels a little bit drier than it could be, or what I expected based on what I saw on the other system. I'm sort of looking for banana peel, and I think that's what we just encountered here. Really nice progress being made on that stuff by these worms. So these worms, these systems, have, I think like I mentioned earlier, is probably about a little bit over a month gap in between their ages. I think this one, being the younger one, is something like 120 or some odd days old, whereas the other one was about 150 something. And the older bin received, or at least the material in that bin received, a number of additional feedings because not only because it's a little bit older. There's another cocoon. I'm just spotting them all over the place, which is really a great thing to see. So the contents of that other bin that we just fed took a little detour before it ended up in that black plastic tub. They were living in buckets that were set up to be breeder buckets for 4 weeks in the very beginning, and then the contents of those couple of breeder buckets was just dumped into that plastic tub. And because they were in breeder buckets, I was sort of visiting in more frequently and giving them feedings every few days, relatively small feedings, but that sort of jacked up the feed count on that system. Whereas the contents of this container were set up in a much more traditional way, where I just created some bedding and plopped in some worms after I rounded them up from their previous home, and this system was kind of launched off in a more direct way, whereas the material that we saw on the other system was kind of set up to promote breeding initially. Alright, so the same as we did before, we're going to take these leftovers that we encountered along the way and drop them down in, and I think we're probably, I don't know, I thought there would have been some pumpkin stem in here too, like we saw in the other system. We saw 2 pretty good sized pieces in the other system. That's what I think we have right here. I just didn't draw much attention to it when I bumped into it earlier. And here and there I'm finding little pieces of corn cob too. The other system had a pretty good size intact piece of corn cob. This one just has smaller size fragments. And now I'm trying to remember what order we had set up the feeding in. I think we had placed all this stuff in like so, and then we might have come in with sort of a little foundation onto which we went ahead and placed the freshly added foods. But before we did that, we tried to spice up this material a little bit by giving it a little bit of worm chow. It's kind of coming back to me, but I'm not really trusting that I'm remembering 100% correctly. We need to account for the deviation here too, though, so I'm going to place in this supposedly compostable bag. Maybe we'll even switch it up this way so the word compostable is visible on top here. Kind of wondering if we might also spur on some enhanced activity down here if we were to even coat the top of it with a little bit of this worm chow before we place in the fresh foods. And, well, fresh is, I don't know, perhaps not the right word for what's going on here. I mean, yeah, it's new to the bin, so fresh from the perspective of this bin's inhabitants. But I think we've created a pretty fair split in terms of both systems getting the same amount for the most part. And I hope that the fact that it's kind of greasy and, whatever, doesn't put the worms off. I don't think it will. I think they're going to like it. And before we top off, we'll just follow suit with what we did earlier, which is just to sprinkle a little bit more of my prepared bedding in over the top. Here I'm still bumping into some of the some of the telltales that was telling me that my last shredder was on its last legs. It's producing these little waffles where the shreds don't come out separated from each other. They're just sort of connected to each other as like a little waffle shaped material. I had actually picked out as much of that as I could when I was preparing this batch of bedding here. And I had a little collection of that stuff that went into one of my other systems. But I think we're ready to cover up the feeding zone now. I'm just going to do so using some of this material that I'm excavating from the outreaches, just so that it gives me a chance to aerate and inspect and to sort of homogenize the material a little bit by sending some of the stuff that was down low out to the surface and vice versa. Some people will, you know, look at what I'm doing here and think to themselves, geez, what is he doing? Why doesn't he just leave those poor worms to, you know, why not just leave them be? I don't know. There's mixed feelings, I think, on the whole concept of aerating the contents of a worm bin versus just leaving it alone. Perhaps it's just because of my experiences in the worm bins where I've had some issues, and I've often just attested those issues to material becoming possibly anaerobic or kind of clumped up and a little bit nasty because of the lack of oxygen content. So I do put a pretty big emphasis on trying to aerate whenever I have an opportunity to, and I try to give myself that opportunity as frequently as possible. So we're done here. There was a feeding zone indicator, which is still holding up well enough that we can continue using it, so I'm putting it right back over where we last fed. And then back on comes the plastic covering. And I am noticing a worm that's hanging out on it. I thought I had inspected it thoroughly enough to confirm there were no worms hanging out on it, but I'm happy to see that the little guy didn't freak out by being out there in the bright light. It didn't end up on the tablecloth or worse down on the floor where I wouldn't see them. And this is really just out here to provide some additional darkness beneath it so that the worms are comfortable coming up to the surface and hanging out below the plastic. Alright, well that's it for this glove. It's going in the trash. And other than that, we're finished here. So before I sign off, let me just really quickly say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's really appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.